come and make some room. Everywhere I go, I'm in the spotlight. This is a good life. I'm living bold. This is what it looks like. On the tipping top of the world.
Happy OSRA 22 Day! Yes, that's right. It's been 1 year since the passage of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. It was June 16th this time last year. And you know, we have a few things to talk about, notably the supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking for unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations, the longest name of a rulemaking, has been released from the Federal Maritime Commission. We're going to give you a high-level overview, but there's a lot going on this week. Hi, welcome to By Land and By Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Began, founder of the Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies, and I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, though, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there is no attorney-client privilege created by this video. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But before we get into the discussion of the day, let's go through my top 3 stories of the week. All right, so I said it 2 weeks ago, I think I put it on here. Last week, we were still on FMC rulemaking watch. This week, we still are, even though we got one of the 3 rulemakings released. We're still on FMC, Federal Maritime Commission rulemaking watch, right? So didn't I call it on when I expected these rules to start trickling out? I mean, maybe it doesn't take a rocket scientist here, right? But June 16th, I was kind of thinking that this OSRA day was going to light a fire. There was going to be some push to get at least one of the rulemakings out. And sure enough, earlier this week, Monday afternoon, I think it was 4:40 p.m., we had this unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking released. So now we're waiting on the detention and demurrage rulemaking. And like I said, it's OSRA 22 Day, so maybe it'll be later today. Recently, and I think for no real reason, the FMC's been posting these rulemaking releases toward the end of the day. I think at least for the past few, they've been released in the 4 o'clock hour. That's fine. We might still have another rulemaking release today. Hopefully the detention and demurrage rulemaking. This is the one I think everybody's waiting for, but don't sleep on the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate one. This one has a lot of really interesting stuff in it. So look, it is 1 year past the signing and passage of OSRA 22, and despite the FMC not strictly adhering to the congressional rulemaking deadlines, right, because technically all 3 rulemakings were supposed to be finished by today, and the supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking was actually supposed to be finished within 6 months, which would have been December 16th. That's fine. Look, the FMC had today, June 16th, in its sights and released at least one of the next round of language. And we've talked about this before. You know, I'm not faulting the FMC because Chairman Maffei has said getting it right is better than getting it fast. And I couldn't agree with him more. I think that the industry is cheering the FMC on for the most part, right? I mean, also these rules regulate somebody, and so not everybody is so enthusiastic. But, you know, I think that the industry for the most part is supportive of the FMC and what they're doing here and what Congress has initiated and kind of given the honey-do list, the to-do list to the FMC. I was expecting the supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking to be released. I still am also waiting on the final text. So I think it's going to be the final rule, the final text of the detention and demurrage billing requirements. Maybe still today, but like I said, last week when we were talking about this, that one might slip. I could see that maybe being released Monday or Tuesday. There's still, you know, it takes a lot to release this stuff for final publication because once it's out there, it's out there. It's out there for review. You know, you don't want them releasing a new modified version while you're putting together your comments. So, well, let's take a minute though, just to make sure everybody's up to speed on this and do a quick overview so that we're all on the same page. So what are we talking about here, right? We're talking about the rulemaking. So after the passage of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, we started watching, especially on this show, 3 major rulemakings that the FMC had been assigned. And so when I say 1 or 2 or 3, this is what I'm talking about. The first one is this unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel-based accommodations. Initially, this was really kind of geared toward exports and categorical exclusions of U.S. exports, but the FMC has expanded this and has kind of dropped that exports piece. They're certainly still looking at the exports, but they've expanded it to also include the import side and just generally be a review and defining of unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations. So that's what we have. That's what was released this week. The second rule that we've been waiting on and watching is the detention and demurrage billing requirements. Remember, this was the one that had over 180 comments on it. This is the one that the industry really has been diving in on. Rightfully so, right? I mean, we've been having some really great discussions on detention and demurrage, when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate, the incentive principle. There's been a lot of stuff happening over the past year, and charge complaints came from OSRA 22. So remember, that's detention and demurrage, or I mean, the chairman at one point even said it might even be more than just these detention and demurrage charges. This might be any and all charges that you'd like to bring in front of them. But the charge complaints section, and I'm doing a little bit of a sidestep here, the charge complaints section actually will have its own rulemaking. I don't expect that anytime soon. They've set up an initial process, a provisional process that has been working pretty well. They're probably the final rulemaking that will commemorate, solidify that process, will be much the same. But just know that's still in flux. There will be a rulemaking. There will be a kind of process, procedure, solidification that happens on charge complaints. But so getting back to it. So the first one is the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel-based accommodations. Say that 10 times fast. I'm getting good at it, right? The second one is detention and demurrage billing requirements. And the third one is unfair or unjustly discriminatory methods, where they've been tasked, the FMC's been tasked by Congress to define unfair or unjustly discriminatory methods under the Shipping Act. This one's going to be really interesting. There has been no text released on this one yet at all. One of the budget documents that the FMC had submitted to Congress when they were going through their budget hearings basically said that they expect some language out on this summer. I think in there it said July-August timeframe. So I wasn't expecting that one by today, by June 16th. I expected that the FMC was really going to focus on the unreasonable refusal to deal and the D&D. The unfair or unjustly discriminatory methods, though, I think is going to be something that a lot of shippers are watching. And my sense is that this one will probably provide some cover. And I think that some of the fear is gone, but provide some cover for shippers who were otherwise maybe afraid of filing a complaint or a claim or some sort of a lawsuit against ocean carriers. But that's not necessarily the only time that I see this being relevant or what they might be diving into. But that's my sense. Unfair, unjustly discriminatory methods under the Shipping Act. So those are the 3 that we're waiting on, right? We haven't seen text on the third, but we've certainly seen text on the first and second. I'm going to keep watching these and let you know what I see. We are going to be talking about the unreasonable refusal to deal very shortly here. Two more top stories of the week before we get into it. But the D&D, we're still waiting. I'm keeping my eyes peeled. And then the unjustly or unfairly discriminatory methods. I'm so anxious to see that one. So I'll keep watching and I'll let you know what I see. Story number 2. Did you hear this? The ILWU and the PMA have reached a tentative agreement. Did you miss it or did you hear it? This has been like the top story, I feel like, of the week. Certainly the FMC rulemaking is important. But the ILWU and the PMA, I think this is, everybody was buzzing. And this one was released, what was it, Tuesday night at 11 p.m. or maybe Wednesday night at 11 p.m. East Coast time. So last week we talked about this. And it seemed that tensions were rising, although, everyone that I kept talking to kept saying they were expecting it to get resolved. And I thought, okay, maybe that's just an easy thing to say. But also it kind of felt like, well, we always get a deal. And so maybe this was no different. And you started hearing that maybe acting labor secretary was going to be going out there. And so maybe that was all true. So even though with the rising tensions, I don't know. I remain pretty confident that it wasn't going to go south. And I say that very cautiously still because this is not a done deal, right? And I think nobody wants to really rock the boat here. And so I'm just saying I'm happy to see that we are where we are here. It looks like that general sense was correct, though, because there is a tentative agreement. It still has to be ratified, and that's why I'm a little bit cautious as I say this. But this is definitely a step in the right direction. So not many details are coming out, but it is being stated, and certainly through some of the actual press releases from the two parties, that it looks like this is a 6-year contract. It's unclear from what date, whether that's going to be last July. So remember that their contract expired last June 30th. So as of July 1st, 2022, the two have been working as kind of an extended, expired contract from their last contract. It's unclear if the 6-year, and we don't know much about this agreement yet, because it still has to be ratified by the members, but it's unclear when those 6 years will start, because obviously if they started from last July, that would eat up about a year, right? We're almost to July. Can you believe it? Yeah. So one thing that has come out, and look, it's hard to know if this is true, but one thing that has come out is a one-time payment of what's being called a hero fund as appreciation for some of those dark days of the pandemic for the ILWU, the International Longshoremen Warehouse Union. And that's one of the components being reported. Like I said, it's hard to know if that's true because the parties have said that they've committed to not releasing details of the provisional agreement. But didn't I say that perhaps, I think a few weeks ago, and I certainly put this in a LinkedIn post, one of the non-obvious factors that was probably at play was that maybe the ILWU felt like they were the forgotten essential worker and just wanted a little appreciation for still showing up during those early scary months when everybody else was sent home during the pandemic. And not everybody was sent home. And there's a lot of, I guess we could just say, there's a lot of forgotten essential workers that feel that way. Whether they were or they weren't, it's tough because everybody kind of came back to work. But the essential workers never left, and they never got that time with their family to rebalance, and it was a scary time. Look, I'm interested to see the rest of the agreement here, and I guess I'm kind of diving into this because I also teach organizational behavior for master's classes at the Massachusetts Maritime Academy, and this is something that we've talked about quite a bit with the ILWU and the PMA, and I always challenge them to look at some of the non-obvious factors. And one of the things that I bring up is that, look, sometimes people just want to be recognized for these scary or difficult moments that they've endured. And I saw that happening with this ILWU and PMA negotiation. And I always tell my students, you'd be surprised how valuable simply filling that need of wanting to be recognized for something difficult can be. And it's not always through monetary means. Certainly the press releases were saying that it was monetary, but that's where I was hoping that the PMA, and we don't have the agreement, right? But that's where I was hoping that the PMA was getting clued into that, right? And kind of understanding that that's what was going on here, because it doesn't always have to be just straight money. It can be other things that show appreciation. And so what this Hero Fund is, it's a one-time fund that's going to be divvied up between all of the ILWU members. Look, I think this is good. You know, even the statement released by the ILWU President Willie Adams earlier yesterday, I believe it was, talked about the rank and file now being appreciated through this agreement for those sacrifices made during the pandemic. So, I mean, it was obviously a very important, non-obvious factor. This was a very unique, very interesting negotiation for many reasons. And now we have to see what the respective members think and hopefully get this deal over the finish line, right? That's the ultimate goal here. We're so close. Let's get it over the finish line, but it has to be ratified. So we also saw Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su being credited for being a helpful and effective facilitator of this agreement. And look, if this is where she starts, I mean, she's not even... She's still acting, right? If this is where she starts, I'm really hopeful for the other labor negotiations that may arise, transportation or otherwise. We've seen recently the rail workers. Perhaps that will now take on, I think that there's still some negotiations and I don't know. I guess all I'm saying is, look, if this is where she starts, this is pretty good. But look, I also want to see some of the initial reaction from the PMA. I've seen a lot from the ILWU, but I also want to see what's going on with the Pacific Maritime Association. Are they happy with how this came out? Are they satisfied? Is this what they want to see? Do they feel as though some of their needs were met? But look, most importantly, we have to actually see what's in this agreement. And maybe we'll never see the whole agreement, but we'll certainly get some bits and pieces of it. Remember, this was not only about automation. It was also about jurisdiction. It was also about pay raises that hadn't been happening in the past 4 or 5 beyond years. Remember, this was in 2019 agreed to a 3-year extension on their previous contract, not knowing that the pandemic was coming down the line. And so they extended their last without having renegotiated cost of living, whatever it is, sick days, healthcare, all the things that are kind of now part of the maybe remote or as much as you can be remote, allowing for administrative days to be remote, work from home. There's ways of helping essential workers so that they don't always have to be in person, especially if there's paperwork elements to their job. Again, something we talk about in the organizational behavior class that I teach. But look, my point being, it's not just automation that was at play here. There were a lot of things in this negotiation. I'm really interested to see what this agreement says. So story number 3. So what does all this mean for cargo movement, right? So let's talk about the Panama Canal. Last week we talked about the Panama Canal. I think this week it became a lot more relevant, especially to the East Coast ports. I haven't really seen a lot of people talk about this. I did see Lars Jensen posted about kind of the same exact thought that I'm having here. But look, with this ILWU and PMA agreement, fingers crossed, done. Almost done. The big question is, will the diverted cargo that went to the Gulf and East Coast now move back to the West Coast, right? So this is Asia West Coast that now went Asia Gulf or Asia East Coast. And my first impression, without the Panama Canal worked in, is probably no, right? For the most part. Sure, we're going to see some cargo move back to the West Coast. It's just a faster route. There's a lot of equipment and kind of infrastructure set up around the West Coast ports that is very crucial, and time is money. But I think shippers like the diversification of the ports of entry, and they won't soon forget the congestion that happened, especially during those 100-plus vessel queues off of LA Long Beach. But that's not to say that those conveniences that the West Coast ports provide, certainly the faster route, isn't important, right? That, of course, it's important. Of course, that's something that's going to be taken into consideration for the shippers. But look, that's my thought without the Panama Canal worked in. So now, as we talked about last week, the Panama Canal is going through a 70-year drought. It's down to 44 feet draft, and their normal operating drafts are about 50 feet. So we're down about 6 feet already. And look, that's a big deal for some of these large vessels. So drafts, let's just make sure everybody's on the same page, right? So drafts are how far into the water the vessel sits. So the heavier the vessel, the lower it sinks, the greater the draft that vessel pulls. So generally speaking, size, these enormous vessels that we've seen in recent years are pulling a larger draft. But also cargo loaded on board can affect that draft load as well. So what's happening, right? The vessels going through the Panama Canal are likely going to have to either be swapped out for smaller vessels for the time being, or they're going to have to load less cargo on board. And so when you start restricting the availability of cargo, right, that restricts capacity. Basic econ means that rates might rise, or certainly you're going to have less available capacity just to be booking cargo. And why is this important? Those vessels that traverse the Panama Canal are going from Asia to the East Coast or to the Gulf Coast, which means this is a potential problem that may get worse before it gets better. I've seen that some reporting is saying that it might even go down another half a foot. It's who knows how far it's going to go down here, but anything that's kind of this squishy, not sure, uncertain world could potentially move this otherwise diverted cargo to the East Coast back to the West Coast, right? Look, supply chains love predictability. Everybody does, but especially supply chains. There are so many moving parts to the supply chain ecosystem, and it all has to work together in this seamless, cohesive dance. So is the drought of the Panama Canal enough to move the cargo back to the West Coast? I guess we're going to see here, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to see more cargo move back to the West Coast than we otherwise would have, just based on but I'm still mad about 2021, 2022. Because while the emotions are still raw and the emotions are still there, it's also about bottom line number. And if it really is that much cheaper or that much faster to go back to the West Coast, we might see that. So we'll see. What I'm going to keep an eye on the Panama Canal. Like I said, I really haven't seen a ton of coverage about this. Admittedly, some of the coverage actually started in May, maybe even as far back as April. I just started paying attention to this recently, but this is a big deal. All right. With all that said, there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot going on. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of the day. We're already well into our show here. So I'm keeping it kind of highlights today. We do have quite a bit to cover, but I'm not getting into it as deeply as I probably will in the future. So look, what did I tell you? Rulemaking language is starting to roll out from the FMC. So earlier this week, we had the first of the three, like we talked about, that we're waiting on from the Federal Maritime Commission. They released their supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking for the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel-based accommodations. This was one of the three rules mandated by OSRA 22, like we talked about, and the FMC took it on right away. Once they got into the rulemaking process, they realized that this rule required care and precision to make sure they got it right. Chairman Dan Maffei has even actually said that this is one of the more tricky, if not the trickiest rule that they've taken on, certainly in recent years, maybe ever. So, which is why they opened up comments for a second time, which is what we have here. This is the supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking, meaning it's still the notice of proposed rulemaking stage. So we've talked about kind of the different stages. There's the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, which is where usually the agency sends out this. We have some questions, we have some thoughts, we'd like to know what the industry thinks about these questions. That's very preliminary. That was the first round of the detention and demurrage rulemaking. Second phase usually is the notice of proposed rulemaking, or sometimes if the agency has kind of a targeted, this is the language we want to use, they'll go straight to this NPRM, this notice of proposed rulemaking. The notice of proposed rulemaking, the NPRM, happened last fall/winter. This is a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. This is a second bite at that pretty big, juicy apple. So if you have thoughts on unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate, or maybe you kind of did, but you want to see what the other comments were, this is your second bite. The agency is now revising some of their language on what they're thinking for this rule and saying, we want your comments. This isn't final language by any means. This is where we're kind of leaning, but we still very, very, very much want comments from the industry. So like I said, this was previously open in the fall. Comments were due October 21. They received 29 comments at that time, which seems like maybe not a lot, especially since the D&D was over 180 comments. But notably, some of these comments came from other governmental agencies, including United States Department of Agriculture and the Department of Justice even, which is kind of crazy. DOJ weighed in. The NPRM, the fall NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, also received comments from 7 members of the House of Representatives and a joint letter with 4 senators, which arguably the House and the Senate were the ones that gave this tasking to the FMC to begin with, right? So the 7 senators were 7 congressmen were Congressman John Garamendi, Dusty Johnson, Jim Costa, Adrian Smith, Mike Thompson, David Valadao, and Jimmy Panetta. They made the point basically that ocean carriers refusing to accommodate American exports is an unreasonable business practice, and following the passage of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022 is also now illegal. That's what they wrote in their letter. And then from the 4 U.S. senators, Senator John Thune, Amy Klobuchar, John Hoeven, and Tammy Baldwin, they wrote a letter as well. And in that letter, they said, we agree with the Commission's view that commercial convenience alone is not a reasonable basis for refusal by an ocean carrier to deal or negotiate. However, we have questions about the breadth of the transportation factors under the proposed rule. In particular, an ocean carrier might point to the existence of scheduling considerations as a basis for refusing to negotiate with a would-be exporter. The senators in this joint letter said, we urge you to consider whether additional clarifying language about the magnitude of the transportation factors might provide useful guidance to industry and align with the goal of promoting an efficient, competitive, accessible, and affordable global shipping market, consistent with congressional intent, thoroughly defining what constitutes the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel-based accommodations is a crucial component of our landmark shipping reform law. Like I said, there were only 29 comments, so this overall rulemaking could arguably be seen as a less watched rulemaking, but the addition of the U.S. government comments made this rulemaking significantly more I don't want to say important, but certainly important to get right? Like now you know who's watching, and there's some big agencies and some some big House and Senator members that were watching. So, okay, so that was then. This is now. What did the FMC release this week? So the proposal revises certain aspects of the proposed rule issued last fall in September by modifying defined terms and discussing the relationship between the United States Code, which is where the Shipping Act lies, and the elements required to establish violations of those provisions. This supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking is issued in response to comments to the original proposal and to more directly provide a potential standard for unreasonable conduct by ocean common carriers that prevent shippers from obtaining space aboard vessels for their cargo. So that all was kind of the intro of this SNPRM. So what does the SNPRM want to change and solicit comments on? The commission addressed that head on right at the beginning. I love that they're doing these kind of summaries of like, this is what's about to come at you. We're going to explain it later, but here's what's about to come at you. And so what they said was the commission proposed to make the following changes. And there were 6 major changes that they said was happening in this supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. So the first, revise the definition of transportation factors to focus on vessel operation considerations. 2, revise the definition of the term of unreasonable to include a general definition and a non-exhaustive list of unreasonable conduct scenarios. So diving into a little bit more specifics there. Clarify that vessel space services are already included in the definition of vessel space accommodations. Remove the voluntary export strategy documentation language. So that was one of the big questions. Is a carrier required to document and submit an export strategy documentation? And if so, what does that look like? What's a export strategy document? They're saying we propose to remove that voluntary export strategy language. Propose a definition of documented export policy, and that ocean common carriers submit a documented export policy to the commission once per year. So now they're kind of saying, look, we didn't want the export strategy documentation, but you might need to document export policy. And later we'll talk about this, but they noted that from staff review, most carriers kind of had a documented export policy. So now the commission is kind of refining that and saying, look, if you already have one, here's the definition of what we want as a documented export policy, and that now we're going to require that you submit that once per year. So that's going to be really interesting to see how people respond to that. Both sides, all sides, right? Certainly the carriers, but all sides. I'm interested to see how people respond to that. And then lastly, remove the voluntary certification provision. So they also addressed a few other things. The overall rule is pretty easy to kind of follow along with. There's a lot here. Like I said, I want to try to keep this higher level, but they addressed a few different areas. So repositioning of empty containers, they talked about. So from the text it says, the commission also notes that nothing in the previous proposed rule or in this supplemental notice of proposed rule is meant to restrict the ability of ocean common carriers to reposition empty containers. The repositioning of empty containers can include the use of sweeper vessels, and vessels cannot be arbitrarily designated as sweeper vessels to avoid accepting exports. But the commission is basically saying that we recognize the importance of and the necessity of sweeper vessels. They said that the commission also found, and this is what we were just talking about, through staff review, that ocean common carriers typically maintain documented procedures and policies related to their operations. And so the commission thinks that effective export policies should be tailored to specific categories of cargo and include documented policies on export business practices. So because every ocean common carrier operating in the U.S. is presumed by the commission, barring the submission of further information to the contrary, and that's kind of what they're asking for here, to be able to transport both exports and imports. They're saying, look, it's got to be, we're presuming that you can do this. It may not be, to be able to transport both exports and imports, an ocean carrier may not categorically exclude U.S. exports from its service without showing how this action is reasonable. And they're saying basically this presumption continues to apply in this supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. So the commission then goes in to address some of the general comments of unreasonable refusal to deal in both new relationships and existing relationships, citing the 2 different authorities in the Shipping Act, going from kind of entering into new negotiations versus existing agreements, whatever it is. But noting that there are similarities between the two, but also proposing to expand the scope of this rulemaking to adequately address all unreasonable refusal to deal situations in these instances. So that's kind of a little confusing, but as you read through, you'll see that they're dissecting it to a pretty fine point just to make sure that they're getting it right, but then also saying, but look, there are some overlaps here, so let's recognize the differences, but also where we can, we'd like to address the consistencies here or the overlaps. So comments to the notice of proposed rulemaking, the previous round, showed that shippers and exporters in particular consistently cited blank sailings, no notice or delayed notice of schedule changes, inadequate loading times, and similar actions as primary drivers that prevented them from getting their cargo to overseas market. These impediments occurred during the execution stage over shippers' interactions with ocean common carriers, taking them outside the scope and beyond the confines of the initial proposal. And so this is what they're saying. This is why they think that it's important to kind of include this stuff in this because it feels as part of it. So the commission says, in order to fully address the comments received, the commission has decided to issue a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking and expand the scope of the rulemaking rather than defer addressing these concerns in a separate rulemaking. The commission proposes broadening the scope of this rulemaking, and they're also working on the separate rulemaking, which is the unfair and unjustly discriminatory methods. Kind of saying that, look, there are some overlaps even with the unfair and unjustly discriminatory methods, but that for this, it's important that we expand and not just have a blank sailings, no notice, inadequate loading times, separate rulemaking. We want to hit it now. We want to do this expeditiously. We want to make sure that we're covering these concerns, these very real concerns. So the text then goes into detailed account of how U.S. exporters are at the mercy of ocean common carriers to reliably and on time deliver those shipments abroad. And it's without this reliability that the U.S. exporters may lose out on these orders, and thereby the U.S. will lose out on these trades. This is kind of scratching that itch of a lot of the exporters saying, look, we can't do it without reliable exports. And that's why this is so important, right? That's why this is, and the commission's saying, we get it. We understand. This is very important. You need, in order to sell your product, you need reliable transportation to send it abroad. It's an interesting thing to kind of come out and say in this rulemaking because it's a little bit, I would almost say it's a yes, we hear you, but it's almost a little bit of like something that I would expect out of Congress, I guess. Maybe a political statement. I mean, it's not exactly. But the U.S., the Federal Maritime Commission is responsible for the benefit of the fair and efficient transportation of ocean-borne cargo for the benefit of the U.S. importer, exporter, and U.S. consumer. So technically, it's within their purview to make sure that they're protecting the U.S. exporter, also the importer, also the consumer. So it's not wildly strange, but it was just it's an interesting thing that they included here, right? So the text, like I said, is also talking about that thorough rulemaking that we're waiting on, the unfair and unjustly discriminatory methods, and basically says, look, they're going to be edging into it, but they want to be clear they will be issuing a separate rule. So, as expected, the commission put the comments and commenters into different buckets and addressed them as such. So they received comments from shippers, shipping industry trade associations, which included, obviously not just shipper industry trade, but also carrier, freight forwarder, customs brokers, and OTIs associations, common carriers, so ocean carriers, and government entities, like we said, but more than just the few that we've mentioned, and addressed at least a few of the comments in the following categories. So they basically said there's general comments from the federal government commenters. They kept them separate. The inability of to obtain vessel space for export cargo, despite having previously negotiated terms and conditions. So that's that existing relationship. And then also reasonableness factors, so documented export policy and legitimate transportation factors. They also addressed elements for determining unreasonableness previously asserted in the notice of proposed rulemaking, so from the fall, based on the statutory text of OSRA 98. So they're saying that there were some elements that they proposed in the fall from OSRA 98, saying the respondent is an ocean common carrier under the commission's jurisdiction. That's element number one. Number two, respondent refuses to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations, and that the refusal is unreasonable. And so for all my lawyers out there, you know that lawyers love elements. We love having kind of a step 1, 2, 3 to satisfy something. That's what the commission is kind of doing here. And they basically said that the commenters were generally supportive of saying that these three elements for determining unreasonableness were pretty good. The commission went into definitions, specifically into vessel space accommodations and vessel accommodations generally. They also went into burden shifting from the complainant to ocean common carrier. So in both burden shifting and rebuttable presumption. So this dealt with the categorical exclusion of U.S. exports from its backhaul trips. But I want to point out here that the World Shipping Council made a suggestion that the FMC did seem to like, and I think that this is important to mention. So the World Shipping Council suggested, and the World Shipping Council generally represents ocean common carriers. So World Shipping Council suggested that the Commission modify the proposed regulatory text for the shifting of the burden of production to emphasize that the burden of persuasion ultimately remains still with the complainant or the Bureau of Enforcement Investigations or Compliance. So what they said was a complainant or the BEIC, Bureau of Enforcement Investigations and Compliance, may seek to establish a violation under the section by producing sufficient evidence to establish a prima facie case of a violation. If a complainant establishes a prima facie case of a violation, the burden of production shifts to the ocean common carrier to rebut the complainant's evidence and justify that its actions were reasonable. And that's what the FMC was kind of saying. Look, we want to shift it over. But then the World Shipping Council continued, once the ocean common carrier has fulfilled its burden of production, the burden of persuasion rests with the complainant to prove its case. And I think that last piece was maybe what the commission was missing, or at least that's what it seems like from the fall version. So the commission basically said, yeah, the commission's proposing to include similar language to that. We kind of like that, right? We wanted to shift over to the ocean common carrier to say, okay, this is what the complainant said. Now you tell me why you think that was reasonable or unreasonable. Obviously, the carrier is going to try to state their claim on why it was reasonable. But then once they do, then it goes back over to prove the case, right? Once the ocean common carrier has fulfilled its burden of production, the burden of persuasion still rests with the complainant. They're the one bringing the case in the first place. So that was an interesting piece. The commission also addressed certification, which is a proposal to include a mechanism for an ocean common carrier to justify its actions through a means of certification, saying a certification should document the ocean common carrier's decision in a specific manner, the good faith consideration of an entity's proposal or request to negotiate, and the specific criteria considered by the ocean common carrier to reach its decision. Like I said earlier, the commission has decided not to adopt a mandatory requirement that the certification be made by a U.S.-based compliance officer, citing actually cost as one of the prohibitive factors. So they want to make sure that whatever they recommend or whatever they kind of bring to the table is also sustainable for everybody, ocean carriers included. So they're saying, look, this mandatory requirement that certifications be made is probably off the table, but these are all things that they want comments on. They also hit a few miscellaneous items, so including things falling under the MTDI scope, saying there were some great comments coming in, but look, this just isn't for this scope, but that they are being reviewed. So the MTDI, the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative, under Commissioner Carl Bensel, he's been looking at the data side of things and the standard side of things. So there were some things about data and visibility that they wanted included that the commission kind of respectfully said, okay, cool, we'll send it over to the right area. The commission also said that this rulemaking is limited to vessel operating common carriers, not vessel, not NVOCCs. So it's only on VOCCs, not NVOCCs. Previously, there was some question over whether this would be expanded to NVOCCs, but the commission said, nope, this is VOs only. So sweeper vessels, we kind of talked about that earlier, but this supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking newly proposes a definition for sweeper vessels. And so the commission says, after reviewing the public comments, the commission wanted to note that the use of sweeper vessel is a legitimate practice that is critical to the efficiency of our transportation system. So basically moving the empties, right? So this new definition, however, does specify that a sweeper vessel must be one exclusively designated for that purpose. In other words, a carrier that does not want to take exports cannot designate a vessel as a sweeper vessel in order to avoid certain shipments. So they're kind of saying, look, you can't pull a fast one. You can't have a vessel that was otherwise supposed to take exports, but now you just don't want to take this certain export. You can't turn into a sweeper vessel. So I think we're probably gonna have some comments along, do we need more specificity on when that kind of switch happens? Does it need to be planned in advance? So for now, that's it, right? I really just wanted to give you the highlights, the overview summary that we even went into some specifics on here, but there's so much more. I really encourage you to review the whole text here. It's about 60 pages, but it really reads pretty fast. It really has, it's sectioned out so that you can read it quickly. It's sectioned out so that you can kind of hit whatever section, whatever content you'd like to read more deeply into. I'm probably going to come back to this in the future and dive in with a little more depth and translation. But like I said, I just wanted to not only let you know it was out, but to give you this helicopter view. It's really interesting. This is worth paying attention to as well. There's some overlaps that will come from this unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel accommodations into other areas of the industry, whether you are focused on it or not. These will overlap into other areas that will eventually affect you. So you have 45 days. July 31st is when comments are due here. I really encourage you to take a glance at this. Pull together some comments. If you think they got it right, they want to hear that. If you think that they got it wrong, they really want to hear that. They want to know where you think they got it wrong. I'll probably release some LinkedIn content that talks about how to do the comments. But really, if you have a story to tell, let them know who you are. Let them know what your company does. And then start talking, right? Start talking about the different areas. If you can section it out into different categories that mimic the FMC's rulemaking, that's going to be super helpful, especially for the probable attorney who's in the general counsel's office who's going to be reviewing this. That makes it easier for them to distill it all in together. But that's it. They don't know who you are, or maybe if they do, but that's so important. That's the piece that I want to make sure that everybody does when they do comments. Make sure that you tell them who you are, who your company is, what the role is in the industry, and why what you're about to say or what you are saying is impactful to your industry. Because as we know, everybody has kind of just a little bit difference here. And so it's important to kind of highlight why is your concern so important for your specific industry or your specific company. So look, but as always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But if you do have specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me at my legal company, Squall Strategies. Otherwise, for the non-legal questions, the e-learning, the general industry information and insights, or even corporate trainings, come find me at the Maritime Professor. If you like these videos, let me know. Comment, like, and share. If you want to listen to these episodes on demand, or if you missed any previous episodes, come check out the podcast by Land and by Sea. And if you prefer to see the video, they live on my YouTube page by Land and by Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. While you're at it, check out the website, themaritimeprofessor.com. Until next week, this is Lauren Began, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and by Sea. See you next time.